Hello and welcome back to your Pennsylvania Dutch Minute. Today we continue our series on famous Pennsylvania Dutch people, and today we're doing somebody that I consider very special, personally to me. I'll explain why, and you'll figure out why later on in the video. But today we want to take a look at the famous Pennsylvania Dutch author Lloyd A. Moll. Now, Lloyd Moll was born on the 29th of September in 1879 in Macungie, Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, a stereotypical Pennsylvania Dutch village. Moll's life began with a love of music and the violin. He would go on to study under the great violinist Heinrich Schradiak, and Moll would then go on later on in life to become the concertmaster of the Lehigh Valley Symphony Orchestra and conduct the Allentown Symphony Orchestra. But along with music, Moll's other great love was our Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, and he was one of the first contributors to the famous Pennsylvanisch Deutsch Eck column in the Allentown Morning Call when it began its run in 1935. On a side note, that series, the Pennsylvanisch Deutsch Eck, which ran in the Allentown Morning Call, was probably is probably the best known Pennsylvania Dutch language newspaper column. It ran for 30 years, almost 30 years. Um, some of them have been digitized. I'm sure that there's probably all have been digitized. You probably can find some online if you look. It was just a great resource full of, it was an opportunity and a place for authors like Moll and other people that were writing in the dialect to get their stuff published so that people could read it. The Eck usually had recipes, poems, short stories, comic strip. Um, you name it, it had it. A great, great resource. But anyway, moving on. Unlike many Pennsylvania Dutch authors of the time in the 1930s and even a little bit before, who were mainly writing poetry, that's what was really popular. I did a video previously on Henry Harbaugh. You know, all of his Pennsylvania Dutch writings were all poems, and a lot of the other authors of this time period, really, I mean, that's what they were writing, poetry. When Moll came along, he broke with convention and began writing prose. And he would be famous for three series of stories um, throughout his life. His first series of short stories was entitled Am Schwarze Bär, or literally The Black Bear, which began in 1935 and ran for 4 years until 1939. Am Schwarze Bär is an imaginary crossroads tavern, hotel, somewhere in eastern PA. He made up a town. I don't even know if he even mentions the actual town. And at this hotel, we meet various characters and read their stories, many of which were humorous and showed the reader what life was like at the turn of the 20th century in Pennsylvania Dutch country. The entire Schwarze Bär series can be found in the Pennsylvania German Folklore Society Volume 12 publication from 1947. Right here it is. Sometimes you can find these on eBay. I don't know if anybody else is selling them. Sometimes you'll see them at estate sales. So the spine, this one is, I have this copy. It's a little worn, but I mean, inside it's great. This has the logo, of course, on Schwarzenegger, and this has the entire series. So maybe look for this online. I don't know if you're interested in building your Pennsylvania Dutch library, but it's out there. So again, that's volume 12 from 1947. Pennsylvania German Folklore Society. So check that out if you're interested. So that was Schwarze Bär. His next series of short stories was called Es Gebabbel im Stor, which appeared thrice weekly from 1938 until his death, which would have been a 6-year run. These sketches were set within the framework of a country grocery store around whose stove the village characters meet. So kind of following the same line of Schwarze Bär, where you had these people coming together to talk. You know, in the first series it was at the local hotel, the local bar, or as we say in Pennsylvania Dutch, the Watshaus, and they would tell their stories. His second series was also this idea of people telling stories, but this time instead of being in a bar room, now they're in a country store, country grocery store, gathering around the potbelly stove, telling their stories. Again, some were humorous, following kind of along the same line, but a different setting. His final series of stories was Stimme aus dem Karikhof, which translates into Voices from the Churchyard or from the Cemetery. And this first appeared in 1941. Again, these were also printed in the Pennsylvanisch Deutsch Eck. That's where all of his short stories were printed, you know, as like a serial. It's almost like a soap opera. You'd open up, and one week you'd have a new story from Moll, and maybe you had to wait a couple weeks until the next story came out. Stimme aus dem Karikhof he composed was a total of 33 stories. in the series, which revolves around an unnamed protagonist who acquires the ability to talk to the dead. Each night, each story, he travels to the cemetery and calls a soul up from the graveyard, and the ghost appears and tells a story from his or her life. The stories cover the gamut of Pennsylvania Dutch life and history. Some stories revolve around the American Revolution. One of the stories tells the life and experiences of a Conestoga wagon driver. We have a very touching story of a father who plays the part of the Belschnickel. We don't know what else Moll had planned because he died while writing this series in February of 1944. One other note of importance about Moll played the part of Asabi in the very first broadcast of the immensely popular radio sketch series Asabi and Sabina, which ran on the Allentown radio station WSAN for years. Now, of course, he died before the series made its entire run, but he was the very first voice of the character of Asabi. Moll's fame was found definitely in his prose, but we must not forget that he was also a master poet in the dialect as well, penning many beautiful, beautiful poems in Pennsylvania Dutch. And I'll close with this quote by Preston Barba. Preston Barba was one of the editors of the Pennsylvanisch Dijkschrift, one of the greats in when we talk about Pennsylvania Dutch writing in the language itself. I'll do a separate video on Barba and his contemporary Buffington, but in a memoriam that he wrote about Moll's life, I want to say this quote, according to Preston Barba, quote, "In his stories, Moll proved himself a master of Pennsylvania German prose. He showed that a literary artist can say what he has to say within the framework of a dialect. Under his hands, our dialect became a pliable medium, responding readily to every need." We have to remember that Pennsylvania Dutch, for most of its history, was seen as a language that wasn't necessarily a language. It wasn't written down. It was spoken by uneducated people. It had a bum rap. But we had people come along like Harbaugh, who we talked about earlier, and particularly Lloyd Moll, who wrote in the dialect, created fiction, literature, essentially created the literature of our language, and gave it importance, and showed that it isn't just a language of dumb farmers in this corner of Pennsylvania. These stories, I've read all of Moll's writings. His stories are beautiful. They would be on course with any other writer in English of the time period. Um, Absolutely beautiful stuff. So I do need to talk about my personal connection to Moll. I mentioned the series Stimme aus dem Karihof, which is the last series that he wrote. And I'm going to brag a little bit here. One of my publications is Stimme aus dem Karihof. I'll hold this here. There's a glare. A couple years ago, I decided it was time to take this series of short stories, which, as far as I know, had only been published in that newspaper column, as Pennsylvanisch Dijkschrift in the 1940s, when he wrote them, and put them out in print again. So there are 33 stories. I took each story, scanned from the original newspapers, and retyped them into Pennsylvania Dutch, cleaned up some of the spellings, and made all that. Sometimes Moll would write a word one way, spelling it one way, and then maybe 6 stories later, he would spell it a little differently. So I tried to make all the spellings match up and the same. And then what I did for each short story was then translate them into English. So in this book, you get the Moll story first in Pennsylvania Dutch, and then right after it comes the exact same story but translated into English. What else I did was, since some of the stories reference historical events in our shared history, I did historical notes and commentary on them. For example, in the short story on the Belschnickel, I give an overview of what is the Belschnickel, where does that tradition come from, what does this character mean to the Pennsylvania Dutch. One of the short stories is based on the event in American history of Freeze Rebellion, or what became known as the Hot Water Rebellion among the Pennsylvania Dutch in the 1700s. I give a historical account on what that was, what was the history behind it, what were they trying to prove, why were they rebelling, etc. There's a story about a Conestoga wagon driver. I give a historical note. I give historical notes about what the Conestoga wagon was, why it's important to American history, etc. So the one thing I think is great about this book is that even if you don't speak Pennsylvania Dutch or you can't read Pennsylvania Dutch, you can read these short stories because they're in English. And it's still, I tried to translate the voice of Moll as best as I could. Um, I didn't take any literary license with it. I did a, word for word translation into the English, and you can at least enjoy his writing, and you can learn a heck of a lot about our history and what life was like in the 1800s and in the late 1700s for Pennsylvania Dutch, Pennsylvania German people here in Pennsylvania. So, a lot of people think, oh, I don't speak Pennsylvania Dutch, so I can't read that book. Well, what's nice is that everything is in English, so you can read all these short stories and get an appreciation for Mull's writings. Some of these stories, having read them so many times while I was working on the project, some of them are laugh out loud funny, some of them are heartwarming, and some of them are downright tragic. There's two or three short stories in here that are extremely sad, and he was able to express all of those emotions in this series of stories in Pennsylvania Dutch, and they translate beautifully into English as well. And if you don't cry during some of these, or at least tear up, then man, you mustn't be human. Because I've read some of these multiple times, and some of them still pull at my heartstrings when I read them, even though I've read them so many times. He truly was a master uh, at his craft, and I can't speak highly enough of Lloyd Moll. So I recommend getting out there and reading his stuff. If you do read Pennsylvania Dutch, then by all means read him in the original. You will gain a true appreciation of the language and what he was able to do with the language. But if you can't read Pennsylvania Dutch, then I recommend picking up my book. It's available at Masthof. I'll put a link in the bottom of the video so that you can, if you're interested in purchasing the book, so that you can at least read Mull in English and get a taste of his ability and some of the beauty of these stories. If nothing less, you'll at least get an idea of a little bit more about our history, a little bit about our culture, and how people lived in the 1800s. So for that alone, it's a great purchase just to get a better understanding of Pennsylvania Dutch culture from Mull's perspective. So there's Lloyd Moll, one of the absolute greats when it comes to our language, specifically as an author. Not the only one, but one of the greats by all means. So I would encourage you to check out his writings. So there you go. If you have an idea for a future video, please email me. My address is at the end, of course. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, well, darn it, subscribe so that you get an update every time I put a new video out. Tell your friends about it. Let people know that, there's Pennsylvania Dutch is still around. It's out there. Hey, you can learn more about it. And I appreciate the feedback that I've been getting, all the emails that I receive, ideas for future videos. I truly appreciate it. I respond to every email that I get. So even if you just want to email me and say, hey, keep doing the great work, or hey, what are you doing? I don't appreciate this stuff. That's fine. I take criticism very well. Okay. Until next time, email me if you have an idea. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Practice your Pennsylvania Dutch and read some Lloyd Moll and Mox Good.
Oscar.